Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2018 EurekAlert PIO seminar held for the first time at the AAAS annual meeting. Thank you to those of you who have traveled to join us here in Austin, and hello to those around the world who are joining us by webcast. The idea of trust and credibility is not new to us as public information officers. After all, we rely on our own credibility as communications professionals and the credibility of our institutions to do our job, whether it's media relations or public engagement, or increasingly a mixture of both. In some cases, we have inherited that credibility, and by extension, the public's trust in us because our institutions have a long history in our local or global communities. In other cases, we've had to carefully build and protect that credibility and trust. But even for institutions, and I'm including media outlets in this category, with venerable history and a track record of excellence, trust from the public can no longer be taken for granted. So how do we, as the bridge between the public and academia, help to build and maintain that trust? And more specifically, how do we do that in our daily work as science communicators? We have a truly international panel of experts here with very impressive credentials. But instead of citing a long list of their accomplishments, I'm going to let them briefly introduce themselves so we can understand the perspectives they're coming from on the topic of trust. As you can see, we've replaced the table between us so that we can encourage more dialogue between the panelists here and all of you PIO colleagues. Speakers will have 10 minutes each. They're not required to use the full 10 minutes. Then we'll open the floor up for Q&A. We'll also take questions from our webcast audience. Since we are live webcasting and recording this session, please wait for the mic. We have two lovely mic runners before asking your question. And if you're tweeting today, please use our hashtag PIOSAM18 and AAAS MTG, which are on the slides as well. So without further ado, I'll start with Dominique.
Thank you, Brian. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation to talk about this important topic. My name is Dominique Brossard. I'm professor and chair of the Department of Life Sciences Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And this is, to some extent, a unique department in that sense that we train professional science writers with a master's in professional studies in science communication, but also we train researchers in looking at the process involved in science communication with a PhD program. We are at UW-Madison, I would say, a case study of how we can evolve in that linkage between the public information officers, the scientists, and the different institutions that are involved in science communication, particularly since our state has faced some issues regarding state funding and so on, where the credibility and the trust in the science created in the institution has sometimes been a challenge at the local level. So one question that Brian has asked us to address is, should PIO assume responsibility in helping scientists engage with local communities beyond press releases? And I'm not going to talk too much about press releases because I know that this is a topic that will be discussed in the Q&A potentially. But I will answer that question by a sound yes. I think, yes, we do have that responsibility. PIO need to actually help scientists engage with local communities, because if they don't, they run into two extremely important risks. Number one, that the scientists will do it anyway and won't do it well. And number two, scientists won't do it, and then it's a problem as well. So how can PIO help scientists engage with local communities? I mean, there's different ways to do so. I would say, number one, to put them in contact with local newspapers that don't tend to cover science issues always the way we would like them to do, mainly because science writing columns are disappearing from those local newspapers. And at the local level, very often, local communities still rely on those local news sources to actually find out what's going on. And I feel, at least in my anecdotal experience, that the local newspapers may not turn to the university as much as they should do. And maybe it is because the local central communication offices of those universities tend to focus on national coverage and international coverage. However, when we talk about public trust, it's really at the local community that you would build that public trust in a way that's meaningful and that actually can achieve important results. I'm thinking of examples of scientists, being ready to go and talk, let's say, at the brewery, and we have example of science on taps and so on, that can be useful and can make a difference, exposing people to some science stories they would otherwise not hear about. That means that public information officers, and I commend the UW-Madison officers in the room because they're doing an excellent job doing so, need to identify those science stories that potentially can help build those bridges. One that we locally had at UW-Madison was a story about urban canites. Coyotes and foxes are a topic that go beyond any polarizing or partisanship and can get interesting to anybody that actually has those in their neighborhoods. The scientist that actually was able to talk about those topics grew a large audience, and he was organized by the local PIO to try to do so. The second thing beyond organizing public engagement activity at the local level that the PIO can do, I think, is also make scientists realize that actually there's no science and the public. We're all a big mess of audiences that all come with their own psychological mechanism when they react to science stories, and it is impossible to know who we are talking to. Remembering that actually there's no the public, there's individuals that have values, that have emotions, that are gonna react to stories in a way that actually makes sense to their own context. And you all in the room and myself, we have a responsibility to make people understand that you're not communicating with the public, you are talking to individuals. And those individuals need to be listened to, they need to be actually taken into account in the stories we tell, because if we don't, obviously they won't understand what we're talking about. And I know that I actually preach to like a choir that knows what I'm talking about. However, again and again, the scientists that go to engage with different audience may not understand that, and you are well placed to make that message sound and clear. And I think I'm going to end up here, and I'm sure others can complement what I'm just talking about. Looking forward to the question later on.
Thanks. So I'm Ruth Francis. I have worked in, as a press officer, I started out in the charity and then in the university sector, and then for many years I worked in science journals, I worked for publishing companies, and I worked hand in hand with many of you to promote the research coming out of your institutions. And I suppose actually Dominique's made some excellent points, and perfect, because that means I can just miss out a couple of my points, because you've talked about local communities. So my main point, I think, in thinking about earning trust is who should we be earning trust with? Right. Because I think if we set out just to try and earn trust without thinking about which audiences that should be and which publics that should be, then we end up kind of spreading ourselves too thin and we don't do a very good job. So I think, if you're working in the charity sector, you want to be thinking about earning trust with your donors, with governments. I mean, the scandals that we're seeing in the charity sector at the moment, there's an awful lot of trust bridges to be built, and I'm not going to comment on that. But, those are some audiences that maybe if you're working in a university, you might not have to think so much about those audiences, but the local community is certainly one of them if you're at a university. Sometimes in charities, you might, if you work in a medical research charity, then there will be patient communities that you have to liaise and engage with. And I think those are really important. Those relationships are very important, and I've got a couple of examples of those. And then from my own more recent experience in working for journals, I'm not going to say it doesn't matter if you're in a journal press office whether you have the public trust, because it does, but I think it's much, much, much more important that you have the trust of the authors who are publishing in your journals, because without those authors submitting their manuscripts, then there are no journals. So starting off with the charity sector, I mean, you know, particularly in medical research charities, because that's what I know, you see issues around, you know, HPV vaccination rates dropping, or around, you know, treatments that are marketed that aren't necessarily proven. And so I think it's really important to engage patient groups and to dispel misinformation. And I think it's very important to listen. So back in, you know, when I started my career, we just had outward-reaching channels, but these days we can communicate both ways. We can listen, and I think listening is really important. My former colleagues at Cancer Research UK was scratching their heads a few years ago and thinking, how do we talk about e-cigarettes and vaping? You know, it's a really big issue in smoking cessation, and they wanted to start looking at the evidence, but there wasn't a lot of evidence. So in 2013, they wrote a blog, and they said, you know, there's not a lot of evidence around e-cigarettes and people giving up smoking, and we're also not sure about how much harm these devices will give you. What they saw when they wrote that blog was this extremely visceral reaction from people who were using e-cigarettes and who were no longer smoking. And they felt like Cancer Research UK was acting in a very paternalistic fashion and telling them the same thing that their doctors were telling them, which was, if you want to quit smoking, then you should go and get some gum or get some patches or do it this way or do it that way. And they felt very much like they weren't being listened to. And Cancer Research UK looked at the comments they'd got, some of which were extremely aggressive across their blogs, across their social media, and they listened to those people, those communities. So a few months down the line, you know, the issue popped up again in the media because it pops up a lot in the media. And so they wrote another blog. And this is important. The evidence had not changed, and they didn't change their stance, but they changed the language in which they framed the evidence. So instead of saying there is no evidence, they said things like, we begin to be cautiously optimistic. And in that way, by changing the language they used and by engaging more with the communities and listening more to the communities, they kind of gradually began to kind of bring them on side. And as the evidence has moved, they've moved forward with those groups on side. And more recently, a national newspaper in the UK wrote an article saying e-cigarettes were extremely bad for your health and they were damaging, et cetera, and Cancer Research UK put out a statement saying, this is extremely irresponsible journalism, that is not what the evidence says, and the vaping communities were jumping up and down for joy, and they saw comments like, I am going to reinstate my direct debit, I'm so pleased the Cancer Research UK is on my side. So that's, you know, a really good example of gaining trust with some of your key people, and the end result was probably an extra donation from a member of the public. So then going to the journals, which is what I know more recently in my career, you have to think about what your authors want. And of course, if you build trust with your authors when you're promoting their research, when you're working with them to communicate their research, then you should be, you know, accurate. You should be hype-free. You should be making sure that they're happy with the coverage. But it's really them that you're working with, and I believe that the public then is like a side audience, and that should build trust with them. But really, your key audience is the authors. I've had authors say to me when I've suggested organising a press briefing that they're nervous, and we've kind of given them a bit of media training. I've had authors say to me, no, I don't want it in my time zone. I'm more interested in international coverage. Yeah. So then you organise it in the time zones that they're interested in getting attention. You know, giving people support and holding their hands and making sure they feel confident. That's the most important thing, I think, with journals, and that's who I would be aiming to earn trust with. Working with Springer journals, much smaller journals than the Nature titles I used to communicate, we were able to kind of build relationships with journalists a bit, you know, as individuals rather than sending everything out blanket. With a smaller women's health journal, for example, we had an author with quite a sensitive piece of research about refugees and women's health issues. And instead of press releasing, we worked very closely with the author. We worked one-to-one with the journalist, and we would make sure that that there was a bigger piece with much more space for the issues to be kind of aired and to go into depth on difficult, complex issues like that. And often at the same time, we'd allow the author to write, we'd encourage the author to write a blog so that their own words were on our blog site, and we'd make sure that those articles were cross-linked. And authors often said to us, we're so happy, not only am I going to send you more papers, I'm going to tell my colleagues to do so as well. And then finally, and this is something that Brian probably knows more about than me, but I always felt like when I was working on journals that you were some of the people I should be building trust with. And working closely with PIOs in institutes who were there on the ground with the academics was really important. So when I would come to AAAS, I would make sure that I would set up meetings with the PIOs from the local universities, from the local research institutes, so we could talk to you about your needs, and when we're publishing articles by researchers from your institution, what are your concerns? How can we work with you? How can we build trust with you to get the best possible result? So in summary, I think my point is don't spread yourself too thin or you won't do it very well. Think about what you're trying to achieve, figure out your priorities and focus on them. And then I think you do in that way, you get the best possible result, and that builds broader trust, but only if you start with the narrow focus.
My name is Euan McKay. I'm at the University of Tokyo, where I'm a press officer dealing with international media particularly, but generally with university communication strategy as a whole. I also have another job, so I work also directly with the president of the university, supporting him dealing with international media and international events. So I have kind of very close relationship with the central administration, but also in the central, we also have a lot of very strong departments or faculties within the university. It's very much a distributed university. So within the university we're working in, every faculty, every department may have their own press officers, or they may have their own staff for dealing with media, but often these staff are not necessarily trained communications professionals. They're often general administrators. So we're working as a kind of a central contact for, particularly when it comes to international media, we kind of act as a central contact for getting information out, and also for transferring skills to people within the university. So I'd just like to mention a couple of other panels that we had this week. So on Thursday, there was a fantastic panel about reaching beyond the science-interested public. And they had great ideas about reaching other parts other science communicators don't reach. And I think particularly there was some talk about speaking in the language that your communities, your publics talk in, and that ties in very much with what I think Ruth was just saying. Another one was exploring public fears and myths on Friday morning. And that gave some great insights into vaccination concerns and safety and food safety in Japan after Fukushima, bacteria, antibiotics. And I want to draw a little bit on the presentation about food safety in Japan by Mariko Watanabe on Friday. So she had a stunning graph which showed the fall in trust in scientists in Japan after the Fukushima disaster, and it fell from over 80% to about 40% the following year. It was quite striking. So talking about Fukushima, as a communicator, I don't really want to damage our reputation, but we received quite a lot of criticism at the time and lost, I think, a significant amount of trust. So part of the reason was, and the reason that scientists in general lost a lot of trust in Japan at the time was that we have perhaps one of the world's leading earthquake seismological institutes, and we didn't predict the earthquake. Also, our alumni are in very leading positions around in the country. So the nuclear power company, the CEO is one of our graduates. The nuclear regulator is led by one of our graduates. Our professors were on TV commentating at the time. And I've also had a personal experience where I went into a local gallery just near the university with a friend who was a friend of the owner. And the owner was very welcoming and friendly at first. And then as soon as she discovered I worked at the University of Tokyo, tone became slightly frosty, to say the least. So we certainly lost a lot of trust and in that immediate aftermath. But I think that the reality is a lot of that was directed at the establishment in Japan, not necessarily at an individual university. The problem is that we're seen very much as part of the establishment. We're the biggest university in Japan. We were set up by the Ministry of Education 140 years ago to modernize the country. We're seen as part of an extension of the government in a way. Over 50% of our funding comes from the government. I mean, obviously, as an independent university, our academic freedom is intact, but that's not necessarily the image that people have. So what can we do? And as communicators, what we're doing at the university is we're not producing our own content so much, we're publicizing what our researchers and what our students are doing. I think one of the most effective things has been that thousands of our students, we're a big university, we have nearly 30,000 students, that's over 6,000 researchers. Thousands of our students and faculty members have been to Fukushima. They've been engaged in hundreds of projects to redevelop, to support the recovery effort there. All sorts of things from manual labor clearing up after the tsunami, educational support for students, school kids in the area. There's been a lot of, and ongoing, that's still continuing today, there's a lot of efforts that have been ongoing. A couple of those I'd highlight. One is particularly reaching out to the local community in Tokyo. So we have a Food Safety Research Institute, and they've been holding science cafe events. So they've held over 100 of these events now, each time reaching some tens of people. And they've also held tours to Fukushima to show what kind of processes are in place to ensure food safety. And another very important effort has been a group of over 50 researchers from our Graduate School of Agricultural and Life Sciences have been working with local communities in Fukushima. They've been engaged in research, so tracking the movement of radionuclides in the environment. They've been looking at how crops take up radioactive material so they can determine what's safe to grow and what isn't. And they've been developing easy and cheap decontamination, soil decontamination methods. So all of this has, I think, contributed greatly to improving trust in the university. And also the last group have also published 2 English language open access books about the sort of methods and discoveries they've made. So also, as Watanabe-san said in her presentation on Friday, trust in scientists in Japan has actually recovered to pretty much the historian, the pre-disaster level. And I think it really has been largely due to the efforts of our faculty, our students, our administrators who have been over there. But we still have this image of the university as a kind of an ivory tower, very much removed from daily lives. So we decided recently, when we set up this new strategic public relations division, where I am, a couple of years ago, we decided we need to tackle that a little bit. So we wanted to create a little bit more of an inclusive image, showing the university as more relevant to people's lives. And we work from a basic model of trust that says that if you're going to trust somebody, you need to show that you need to share some kind of common values with them. You need to be aware that you both have something in common. And you need to be aware that, feel that that organization is able to fulfill those goals or support those values. So we've put in place a whole bunch of different projects here. So one is we're working with an alumnus who is a professional copywriter. So we're developing we've asked our students and alumni to come up with a slogan that kind of encapsulates what the university stands for. And we'll be using that in our English and Japanese communications going forward. We've put people basically at the center of everything we do. So our basic strategy now is just to promote individual researchers as much as possible, show what they are doing in local communities, show them as people, not as abstract or distant researchers. show the motivations for what they're doing, show the passion for the research. Internationally, though, we've got a slightly different issue. In Japan, everybody knows us. The University of Tokyo is universally known. I think it's not arrogant to say that, it's just the fact. Internationally, though, of course, we don't have the same kind of recognition, so we really need to work on that. To be honest, science communication, English language science communication in Japan is probably a long way behind you guys. So we're now just catching up. So from next year, in a couple of weeks, I'll have 2 new staff starting to write English press releases for us, so we'll be reaching international media that way. We'll have a new news site coming on in a few months, so we'll have all of our communications material in one place, and then from there we can start to build bridges to media and to publics. And then I think we'll have roughly caught up with everybody. But there's a couple of different audiences that we do need to gain trust with. And I think one of those is academics within the university, our own academics. Because normally in Japan, academics write their own press releases in Japanese. The media situation is very different. We have a lot of professional science journalists in the media, so that means that even if your press release in Japanese is filled with jargon, they'll still accept it. In English, of course, that's not going to work. And if you receive a 7-page press release in English, you're probably not going to read the whole thing, I'm sure. So we need to develop trust with our researchers that we're actually going to be promoting their research accurately or in an effective fashion, while still not using jargon, which is seen as the sort of accurate way of describing their research. We also need the trust of administrators, because there is no kind of professional press office, a professional PIO in Japan. So we need to develop an awareness that this is a useful function. It's not just about writing press releases, it's all about media relations too. There's other activities that go on around that. And long term, so we're hoping to develop professional PIOs who have those sorts of skills, the sort of value-added skills that can then gain trust with local media and international media and with academics. And then we hope on the basis of that kind of trusting relationship, we'll be able to convince more researchers to engage in outreach activities with local communities. Because at the moment, there's very much a sense that having published a paper, that's the outreach, right? They've done their bit. Obviously, there's a lot of exceptions to that, but we need to get a lot more people involved in promoting their own research and showing the passion for research that they have to the local communities. So I hope that will gain the kind of shift we want domestically in our image, and that also increase the international recognition for our university that I think our faculty and students deserve. Okay, thank you.
Hey there, everyone. My name is Nicholas St. Fleur. I have been writing I'm a journalist. I've been writing for the New York Times for 3 years now, and I cover a lot of the fun stuff, if I'm being honest here. I write about archaeology, paleontology, and astronomy. So my editor likes to call me our dead world correspondent. So I write about things that have been dead for a while, a really long while, and then things we never know. They may have been alive, they may have never existed, right? So before I was at the Times, I wrote for The Atlantic, where I wrote about science, technology, and health and medicine. I've also written or interned at NPR and Scientific American and Science Magazine. So I've been doing this for probably about several years, I would say. Yeah, so with this particular panel, it's interesting to have a journalist come here and kind of speak about what our thoughts are on how PIOs can, earn trust with the community. And I've spoken to several of my colleagues about this, like Claudia, and kind of what exactly would I say to your group? One thing I wanted to kind of start off with is a bit of a misconception in science communication. By that, I mean science journalists, science PIOs, we're not on the same team. We may share a common goal when it comes to accurately communicating your science, but science journalists beholden to their readers. Science PIOs beholden to their universities and their institutions. Now, I'm not trying to be adversarial or trying to call anyone's integrity into question. But if I were to pose to you a scenario tomorrow, your university's star scientist who brings in millions and millions of dollars in grants all of a sudden is caught up in a plagiarism scandal or caught up making up their research or in a sexual misconduct scandal, sexual harassment, which is happening more and more these days. We're going to report on that. And it's up to you. What would your institutions be doing in that case? Would you be hindering reporting, or would you be, I don't know, could you be hiding things? Could you be working to kind of accurately explain what is going on? Because those scenarios exist, I have to say that journalists and PIOs are not on that same team. But with that being said, in recent years, and as I said, I've only been doing this for several years, but I've still seen a growing, I guess you could say, responsibility for press officers when it comes to accurately explaining science communication, accurately communicating your science. Now, what do I mean when I say that? It's no surprise to anyone here that journalism is and has been declining, and there aren't as many science journalists as there used to be. Now, what does that lead towards? When you ask someone kind of what is their biggest gripe with science communication, one of the things they tend to bring up is science journalists, they overhype the science. They say that this is some kind of breakthrough, that this is going to be life-changing or change the world. Is that always the case? As many of you guys know, no. Now, there was an interesting Twitter conversation about this, which I wish I could provide you all with a link towards. But they asked, basically, people were chiming in, basically saying, should a scientist be able to look at a journalist's copy, which is kind of our jargon for their draft, before it goes up? I was actually surprised to see how many scientists said, yes, definitely, we should be looking at it if you want your work to be accurate. And a good amount of journalists have completely the opposite viewpoint, saying, no, we don't show our work to our sources beforehand. We can fact check, but we don't. And a lot of times, for scientists, science communicators, PIOs, in some cases, not only is that not the norm when it comes to crafting a press release, but that seems counterintuitive. Why wouldn't you show me your story, right? I'm here to check for accuracy. I'm the expert. But I'm a journalist, right? I can cover, if I'm covering any beat, I don't show politicians my story before it comes out. I don't show, I don't know, it could be executives at an oil industry or any industry, what I'm writing before it comes out. Scientists, science communicators on that part of the spectrum need to, I guess, better understand that that's how journalists operate. Now, where I'm going with this is that, with that being said, there are fewer and fewer journalists, so the responsibility to get things accurate and to not overhype things are falling on the shoulders of PIOs. So in that Twitter conversation, there were people chiming in who have done research on this, looked at when a study is overhyped in the media, where does that come from? And if you trace it, now I'm not saying all, but in many cases, you can trace it back to the actual press release. They use language that is over-expressing what a finding is. And in some cases, you can even trace that back to the scientist. Now, if our goal is to communicate science accurately, if that's the goal of your institutions, and I think that's something that would reflect well upon your institutions, just being when it comes to creating trust with the community, I would suggest when it comes to writing your press releases, making sure, of course, you're not overhyping things, but challenge the scientist. If they're saying something that you just think is not accurate or just not really capturing the full picture, I would say you have a responsibility nowadays to challenge that. I would also say, write in your press releases limitations of work. I mean, science is messy, right? I mean, not every study covers or finds an answer towards every question. If you want to accurately explain what is going on in a study, you should let people know that. Now, the reason why I bring that up relating to my earlier point, is science journalism is not the way it used to be. A lot of it is aggregation nowadays. Fewer and fewer science journalists are going that extra step to verify facts, to call people, get outside sources to comment on a paper. Fact checkers are disappearing. Even at the Times, we just got rid of all of our copy editors, which has had some changes in the work we produce. Now more and more of the fact checking falls on the backs of reporters like myself. So going back to the whole idea, should journalists ever show their copy to scientists before it comes out? What a good journalist does is you can call up the scientist and fact check, as in, was this millions, was this billions? Was it 6 teeth you found in that skeleton? Was it 7? Those are the things that science journalists should be doing, but for your purposes, tell your scientist to, when they're interviewing with someone, say, hey, can you fact check with me? Don't tell them, and a lot of scientists, I'm always on the phone and they say, can you send me the version? Say to them, ask the reporter if they can fact check with you. You don't want to see the copy, you just want to fact check. That will help towards getting trust, kind of communicating your trust. Now in terms of people aggregating, more and more people take sentences or statements or quotes from press releases. So you guys have, at least from my perspective, I would argue more power than you have in the past, because a lot of times your press releases are appearing verbatim to the public in outlets. So do understand just how much of this is your responsibility. Now, with that being said, there are other ways to actually communicate, have your scientists communicate their work. There are growing publications like The Conversation, where your scientists can write, and then that's edited by journalists. I think there's also one called Massive Sci. I would also, if your goal is to kind of get your scientists' work out there to as many people as you can, also look at those outlets. One thing that freelancers tend to have a mindset of is, if I have a story, I'm going to try and see how many angles, how many different markets I can sell it to. If you have a new study coming out, not only will you have your press release and such, but have your scientists do something in like The Conversation or something, or a Reddit Ask Me Anything, to engage with the public. More and more what I'm seeing a lot of are people in the public want to hear from the scientist. Journalists, they appreciate our work, but very often they want to know what the scientists are finding here. So keep that in mind when it comes to engaging with communities. Now going back to kind of the hype machine. For us journalists, if we get a press release and it has a word like breakthrough, normally that means it's not a breakthrough. If it has a word like novel, that means we really couldn't find anything better to say about this work. Be more conscientious of how you're marketing your stuff, because we're very skeptical. I would also say when it comes to building relationships with journalists, I've thought about this for a while, and the word trust might be a bit strong here, but when it comes towards PIOs who I work with on a basic, who I work with regularly, who I know will give me a story that isn't malarkey, all right, is sound science, I would say people who, without having to do my own background research on what the institution has or what that person has, I would say there's about 3-4 people, PIOs, through my career who I can consistently say they are giving me good stuff. I'm fine, they can give me a call and I'd be happy talking to them. This is how journalists think, right? We're very skeptical. We think people are trying to get over us. People are trying to do their best to just promote their work, but we're interested in what the public want, what is going to work well with the public, what they should know. Okay, we're not interested in promoting just your institution or being a line on your CV when it comes to scientists. Like, we're here for the communities, for the audience. And now, kind of in closing, one area I really wanted to kind of just address. Science communication should reflect all the communities that science affects. I know this is a self-selecting group and there are people who are watching online, but I mean, if you look even around in a room like this, do our science communicators reflect all of those communities affected by science. And I've been in this long enough to realize, even on especially on the journalist level as well, that is not the case. I would urge you guys to also look out for scientists at your institutions who are doing good work, who come from underrepresented backgrounds, underrepresented communities, and approach them and learn more about their science. These are also people who could work as nice sources for other science journalists. The science we communicate, and you guys are in a position, really a position of power, gatekeepers as to whose science gets out there in the public. I mean, you're a layer, journalists are a layer. I would challenge you guys to look at that direction, really look to communicate that science that affects everybody, all of these communities, because that's what science really is. So thank you guys so much for your time, and we're very much looking forward to any questions you guys may have. Thank you.
Okay, so before we open up for questions, I just want to do a quick poll of a few questions here. Raise your hand if you've ever interviewed a scientist who doesn't want to share any personal details about themselves or emotions. Thank you.
Interesting.
How many of you have worked with scientists who are very anxious about working with reporters? Wish I had a picture of this.
Yeah, right, that we should take a picture.
How many of you are involved with your institution in setting the strategy, communication strategy, but also identifying who your stakeholders are? Okay. And finally, how many of you have hyped a press release because you think that's the only way to get the media's attention?
Zero.
I'll let you think about that a little bit. So one thing that I kind of want to bring out from our panelists' points is I think we know that there is intrinsic credibility in scientists. There's intrinsic credibility in institutions, universities, research institutions in general. And there is credibility in journalists. And oftentimes in doing media relations, we are sort of exchanging one credibility for another, right? We want the Nicks and the Claudias and the Polyps to write about us because we want them to lend their credibility and their media outlets' credibility to our work. Now, you can only do that if there's mutual trust. And if there's distrust between scientists and the media, it is incumbent on us as PIOs to build that bridge. So that means you have to build trust with the scientist, and you have to build trust with the journalist. And when the two sides are having issues, you're the child in the middle that says, Mom and Dad come together and hold hands. I can tell you many times where scientists are concerned about doing interview, but because they trust me, having worked with them over a long period of time, when I say, yes, this is a trustworthy journalist, you don't need to review the copy. They have a reputation that they need to uphold. They will do their jobs accurately and ethically. And I think that is a responsibility that PIOs oftentimes overlook. We're not just news release writers. We're not just facilitators of conversations. We are actually the bridge that holds these two worlds together. So I wanted to sort of put that out there. But I would love for our panelists and for you to share any experiences and advice for how to make scientists more humane. I think that they spent a lot of time from their education to their career to be seen as objective, to be seen as not emotional, to be seen as not humane. But I think we've also learned that the most effective way to connect with people is through personal connections, is through values and emotions. So how do we as a community help that happen?
So I can start, saying that also it's part of, it's a responsibility at the institutional level to train scientists. I always talk about the next generation of scientists who will know also about the social aspect of science and not about the hard fact related to their research. At the University of Wisconsin-Madison, for example, we have a minor in science communication that's open to all the PhDs in the bench sciences and physical sciences. And we've seen that actually people that come out of that program have already changed their attitude. And in the institutions where you don't have that, I think the PIOs can actually point to some workshops at AAAS, for example, things like that, where you will have that, if you wish, that training, that education that would take place. I think that's important to think in mind.
I mean, I think, as I mentioned, when I started this career back in the dawn of time, we only had one-way communications, and we used to think about what could we get out there. Right. And I think things have just got a lot easier because of the way that our channels have diversified, and also because scientists embrace those channels now anyway to communicate with each other. So I think, it's easier to encourage them to show a human side, to write a blog, to upload a video to social media, to show a bit of their personality. And okay, still, some of those scientists who are very good at that still are terrified. If I said Nicholas and Fleur would like to speak to you, they'd be like, what do I say? But, you can do that hand-holding, and you can, I think the tricky bit is always to encourage the scientists to tell stories, because in their journal publications and in their papers, they have to deal in kind of not anecdotal evidence, in statistics and in the numbers. And so I think what I've tried to do is encourage researchers to think about the stories and tell the stories, because people remember stories more. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the bit that I sometimes have a bit more trouble drawing out of them. But once we understand that we're working with different audiences, for different mediums, different audiences, different reasons for each different type of communication, things get easier.
And as a scientist that interact with from the other side of the table with PIOs that cover my own research, I can tell you that what works is I developed that personal relationship with some PIOs at my university. I like them. Mm-hmm. They're people I like to go and have coffee with. Mm-hmm. And I spend 45 minutes having a super interesting conversation about something, and naturally I end up telling them stories because I trust them, and I have that relationship of trust that let myself, to some extent, expose myself, be more vulnerable, and that helps them, in a sense, write those stories.
Yeah. All right, questions from the floor. Marnie in the back.
Yeah, I'm Marnie Jensen.
One sec, Marnie.
I'm Mari Jensen from the University of Arizona, and I have a question about this issue of hyping news releases, because I know it's been said a lot, and Mr. St. Fleur, you cited at least one example of where there was research about it, and you said, yes, the research said that science stories that appeared to be hyped about the research came from hyped news releases, and that's been discussed. I'm thinking of something that was a couple years ago. I think it was about biomedical stuff. And one of the things that report also said, but it's been turned around the other way, the way you put it, is that 75% of the news releases those researchers looked at weren't hyped, and that the news stories that resulted from those weren't hyped. So, I appreciate your concern, but there's two ways to look at that story, and if 1 out of 4 news releases are hyped, it also means that 3 out of 4 news releases are not. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested, there may be other researchers that people in the room know about that says something different, but I'd be curious about people talking about that.
Sorry, I'm already mic'd up. That is an excellent point to bring up. And, the more and more I think about it, I don't want to come off as too tough on PIOs in that respect. You're right, there are a lot of press releases that aren't overhyped. And a lot of this does fall on the journalist as well. My recommendation to PIOs, to scientists, is when you're interviewing, when you're getting interviewed by a science journalist, of course, not only be as accurate as you can be, but say, if you're going to say this, say it in such a way is more accurate than saying it in other ways. Now, by that, I say whenever I'm talking to someone, I say to them, so can I really say this is the oldest example of something? And they'll say it's more accurate to say the earliest example of something because it's what we haven't found the oldest. It might be older. I think giving scientists training to say, listen, I don't want you to overhype this. I don't want you to say this or to say that. Or sometimes I've been in examples where I'm writing a news story about something that already came out. And I'll ask the scientist, I'll say, you know, this report said such and such. I'm not sure if that's accurate. Can you clarify for me? I would say a lot of that also goes back to the whole fact-checking aspect. Have your scientists say at the end of their interviews asking, can you fact-check with me? It would make me feel more comfortable. Again, fact-checking, when I do it for just about every one of my stories, depending on deadline, where hour before an embargo lifts or something, I am back on the phone with the scientist. I make a separate document that says, this fact, this fact, this fact, this fact. And I just run through, I say, just give me a yes or no, these are just facts. It's not my story, these are just the facts. And they appreciate that, and because of that, I've written stories that haven't overhyped things. Now going to your question about the research, yes, you have a very strong point there. And yes, I am not saying that every press release or every story that is overhyped by just the people who write the story. But I think it's surprising to some people who might read a story about a study that they view is overhyped to realize that the text in that story that is a bit inaccurate, you can find that same text in a press release. And I mean, of course, this is anecdotal. I see it all the time. And it's something that, for me, I wish we had more journalists who go to outside sources. Part of what I do is when I talk to outside sources, I send them press releases. And sometimes I ask them, when you read that press release, did you think it was being oversold? And I get people always coming back to me and either saying, you know what, they're making this claim and the press release is saying this, the paper is not saying this, I don't agree with it. So I would say a tool for journalists, which maybe apply to you guys, but I'll link it to you guys in 1 second. Journalists need to get outside sources on stories. Now, what does that mean for PIOs? You guys have a lot of experts at your institutions, right? You guys can recommend those experts for, there are now growing and growing databases of scientists. I know one called, there's 500 women scientists, I want to say. There's Sciline that was just started. But you could also unsolicited email journalists and say, hey, you just wrote a story on this. I want to let you know if you have any future stories, we have these experts in this field. Please just want to put it out there if you ever need another source on this. And there have been multiple times where people have done that for me and I've used those sources because the key towards, in my opinion, writing accurate science news is doing your own peer review as a journalist. I hope that gets towards part of your question. Thank you.
We'll go to Claudia, and I think our panelists have responses too.
I just want to do like a brief comment, Nick. I think there was a lot of hype about that hype study.
And I'm also, just to get back to, this is sort of partly speaks to that, and also to what Brian said about, you know, like as PIOs, we are the middle people. And, you know, I am now freelancing. I work for myself. I'm not beholden to anyone else. So I can finally say it. I'm free of the shackles. Because for years and years and years, I have watched as journalists say it was the scientists and scientists say it was the journalists. And then everyone points the fingers at us and blames us. And we are not, you know, we are professionals and we do our best. And I have seen examples. I have had arguments with editors on journals where I have a press release and I say, and this could represent a drug target for this disease. And they say, that is not the point of the paper. And I say, it is there in the abstract. It is there in the conclusion. It is in the manuscript. And the scientists have to say that because they want their grant money. The way that the research has been packaged up in the first place is a narrative version of what really happens in the lab anyway. Right. And loads of research never even sees the light of day because it doesn't make up part of that story. So, and this goes to the point that Brian had on the Twitter cards that he was putting here. The whole system is skewed towards hype. And I'm not, okay. I don't think it's always the scientists, I don't think it's always us, and I don't think it's always the journalists, but I think so much of the time we get the flag, and it isn't really our fault as much of the time as people seem to say it is, but because we're professionals and because we're press officers, we sit there and we suck it up because we want these mommy and daddy to be friends with each other at the end of the day.
Claudia.
Okay, I'm ready.
That felt good?
Thank you,
That's what you really came to say, isn't it?
I'm done.
Is the
Shelby,
mic
can you check
on?
this on?
Is it on?
Better. Listen, I'll just use my human voice and look up. I'd like to echo some of the things that you said, which I think there's a need for a little love and understanding here, because it's off.
It's off?
That's on now.
It's on now.
Yeah.
What? Can people hear me?
No, we are pretty close. Yeah, 4 o'clock. Shane?
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll just do the best we can. I think the issue very much is
not really putting yourself in the other person's shoe or hat or clothing. If you were on the receiving end of some of the pitches that a reporter routinely gets, you would see that there is a problem. If my inbox could speak, the kinds of garbage that we routinely, to be frank, that we routinely receive and have to plow our way through, the kind of inappropriate pitches by people who clearly haven't been reading what we're doing, it makes you not trust the sender. And things on our side are very, very, very important, and much is at stake. What's at stake, for instance, is our credibility with our editors. If we go out on a story that doesn't pan out, our editors don't like it. They've spent an enormous amount of expense money. So a PIO who tells me that an interviewee is more articulate than they actually are, who tells me that the research is more important than it bears out to be, or sends me to somebody who isn't really going to talk to me when I do a Q&A, and what's really important is the voices and how articulate the person is, that's not going to be somebody I trust, because it, just like you have to respond to your sources, I have to respond to mine, which is the reader and my editor. So some of this involves some two-way understanding. I understand that you, as PIOs, are trying to drum up support for your university and get the university brand out there and talk about all the great things you're doing. But it's really important to be accurate, because we won't go back to you again if we have been burned. We can't trust you then. So being fully accurate is the first step in trust. And sometimes perhaps even telling your university presidents and your administration, this is not something that we ought to be pitching.
Thank you, Claudia. We have a question in the back. Okay, we'll have the question and then. Still not working? Shane, thank you.
Shane, you're just going to have to run twice as fast.
This is why we have two.
I just wanted to say thank you for the feedback from the journalists that we've heard from today. I would actually argue that one of the most important steps in building trust is respect, and I'm not hearing a lot of that from the journalists that we're speaking to today. So if we could just come meet somewhere in the middle, just to try and figure out what's the best way to build a stronger relationship, that would be appreciated.
Do we have any online questions? No.
I'll just make a comment on that. I was a newspaper reporter for nearly 30 years, and now I've been a science environment flack for like 6.5, and I was the worst of the worst. I didn't want to deal with any press officers. I got my own sources. I got my own interviews. That was the way I worked because I didn't have any trust, and also it was different times when I was starting out. I think your point is really interesting, Nick, about how there's more responsibility on the PIOs now. There are more and more former journalists who are PIOs now, and there are less and less journalists able to devote the amount of time necessary. So I am also sometimes shocked as well as pleased at how my entire press release ends up as a story. I mean, I try and write in an interesting and always accurate fashion. I do, because that's just what I believe in. But I have to say, I have also learned that PIOs can be really helpful, on deadline. I mean, I always kind of sort of knew it, but when you need a good expert, when you need to have that science translated, we can be very good brokers in between. I do think it's important to understand the journalist's role. Journalists are questioners by nature. They're skeptics by nature. So it is part of the process. But yes, speaking as a long-time hardened former journalist, we can be a little too edgy. So I do think your points are very valid about how more and more of the public information that's getting out there, though, is in fact crafted and created by us. So that's all. It's just some observations from somebody a little long in the tooth on this.
That is, when I'm working on more of a feature, is what I would echo with what you just said, and thank you very much for the contribution. When I am working on a feature, and I'm looking for scientists who are experts on a specific area. I mean, I just wrote one about dinosaurs, right? It's actually for kids, but it's a fun one. And for that, I reached out to a PIO, and I asked her, basically, are there experts at the museum who could speak to me about this? I ended up not using those experts, but I went to that person to get responses. A lot of times, when it comes to the PIOs who I do that with, though, and I'm sure this is probably reflected in other journalists as well, those are PIOs I've met in person. Those are PIOs who I've worked with on stories before. They're PIOs who I have built a trusting relationship with. If I'm working on something and I want to find someone who is an expert in a particular field, and I'm on deadline, but I also need to make 5 other phone calls, I'll call a PIO, and I do this all the time at NASA. I'll call up, there's a lady there, Lori Cantello, and I always call her and I say, hey, listen, I need someone who could speak to me about this finding. My deadline is 3 p.m., 4 p.m. Can you find someone for me? And I just do that, go on doing the rest of my work. I get a ping a little bit later from her saying, hey, yeah, here's this expert on this. You can interview them now. And that has helped me so many times. So when it comes to respect between journalists and PIOs, I don't want to give the impression that we don't respect the work you do, because we do, we definitely do. We are just, as I said in the beginning, on different teams here. And for a journalist, we don't forget that. And we try not to let those lines blur. So, yes,
Thanks.
I've referred to PIOs on Deadline numerous occasions who I have built a relationship with, who I think will find me the source I need when I need it. So, thank you.
I think it's important to remember that we are not on the same team, but we're ultimately working towards similar goals.
Yeah.
I don't want to say we're working towards the same goals, because ultimately we are beholden to our institutions, but I would like to challenge you guys as public information officers to also advocate for the public's rights in cases where things can be dicey. I think in terms of, especially in crisis communication,
Right.
in managing issues, I feel that we can live up to the expectation of the public to also speak on their behalf. And I think if we can aspire to that, then the press releases we write that get aggregated on websites that become sort of the record of some papers, then has a better chance of reaching a larger audience. Are we changing the topic, or are we talking more of the same?
Change the topic.
Brian,
Okay.
can I,
Yeah.
got a couple of comments?
Yes, Euan, and then the lady in the back.
Okay.
Shelby is standing right behind you.
So a couple of things. So building on what you just said there, as the University of Tokyo, we're a national university. So we very much think about the taxpayer in Japan. We think about
Right.
our service that we have to provide to the public. So that is definitely one of our primary motivations. Talking about hyping as well, hyping research as well. Well, we are very, very careful about, as press officers, about what comes into us. We check exactly what the researcher is saying and whether that really is reflected in the paper, whether that's accurate. However, we have the usual suspects. We have 6,000 researchers. There are a few who are a little bit more optimistic about the impact of their research, perhaps. So the thing is, we know who these people are after the first time. So we always do our best to make sure that we don't let anything like that through. But after a while, we build up a knowledge of who are the people we should be particularly careful about, and we are. So we make sure that whenever we do publish it, put anything out, it is as accurate as possible. And also that we find from journalists contacting the university, if they contact researchers directly, obviously there's a language barrier there as well. So if you're contacting a Japanese researcher at our university in English, a lot of the time they'll just ignore that. But what we found is that if the journalist contacts us as the press officer, and then we tell the researcher that this person is going to be in touch and we've dealt with this journalist before, you can trust them to write an accurate story on your research, they'll often then, or almost always then, actually respond to the journalist. So I think we feel perform a useful function there.
I'm Jenny Cox, and I'm a PIO at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I would argue that we actually are, journalists and PIOs really do have the same goal, and that is to educate the public about the science that is being done all over the world. And it would be counter for us to overhype a story because, just as Nick said, he's not going to trust somebody, or the other speaker said they're not going to trust you. And it is your job to be trustworthy and to get stories about the research put out. As a matter of fact, at our institution, we typically, before we do a release, talk to other researchers in the field that are not at our university to make sure that what we're saying about our research is not hyped, or that we're not saying we're the only ones that do something. With that said, as Euan just pointed out, every PIO in this room probably has been burned by a researcher. And that is an unfortunate fact, but as long as journalists work with PIOs with mutual respect, you will find that you will have fewer times when that happens, because we, as Euan mentioned, once a researcher burns us, we don't talk to them again.
Do you mean researcher or journalist?
I'm sorry?
Did you mean researcher or journalist?
The researcher. And actually, there are journalists that have burned us as well, and we do not respond to them either.
Yep.
I mean, it goes both ways.
Well,
I mean, I think on Hype, I think the people who sign up for a seminar like this and who are in this room and who are watching on the live screen are the people who are generally going to be responsible. But then there are going to be people who, and we've all, you know, when I started out, there were fewer resources, and you'd be spread so thin, and there were people in universities who, you know, worked on the principal's lunch one day and promoted something internally the next and got a science paper across their desk the next day, and they weren't necessarily as professional as we in this room are. And some of the challenge, I think, when it comes to Hype is reaching those people. But I think, I mean, there are other audiences that I think we can talk about rather than just the mass media.
Yeah. I don't want to turn this into a therapy
I just
session.
wanted to say that.
But quickly, and then Sue, and then I want to raise a point about local communities, and we have an online question.
So there's a difference between PIOs and PR professionals that are hired by universities.
Right.
And I think PIOs get lumped in with PR people, and we're not the same thing. It's not our job to hype stuff.
can I
Sue?
respond? No? Okay.
Sue?
I'm Sue Nichols from Michigan State University, and I guess I'm a little surprised, and I'm trying to help you, Brian, turn this to another place. Yeah. Would others here agree that PIOs, as we call ourselves, are really no longer, as the world has evolved, merely handmaidens to journalists? When I started this career a long time ago, that's what we did. We woke up every morning wondering, how can we make Nicholas notice us? And how can we make him happy? And that's still a portion of my job. And I'm always happy when you're happy. But I'm hoping we can have more of a discussion. When I came here to talk about credibility, I didn't think we were posed against each other. I thought journalists and science communicators who work across a broad spectrum, if I could quit using the damn word press release, can we all just agree we're not going to say that one more time here? Right. We all communicate science across a broad series of platforms that reach many audiences that sometimes have to do with you, Mr. Reporter, and many, many times have not a damn thing. So I would love to talk about how all of us who communicate science can build trust with the people.
Online question? Jen over there.
So we have two questions from online. The first one is from Eva Kostadnova with Pensoft Publishers. What advice would you give PIOs having problems with persuading researchers that publicity in general, rather than individual journalists and media outlets, is actually valuable and trustworthy as a practice? The same question goes for social media presence.
How do you convince scientists who are not currently doing any outreach to start?
Well, I mean, something that's been, first of all, I don't want every scientist out there doing outreach. I do believe that actually PIOs and science writers know the best how to do so. But however, we do need also, you know, as far as critical mass communicating about science, it's important to also have scientists that do it well to be part of the equation. Something that's been useful in our institution is actually quoting my own research with my lab, where we showed that actually interacting with journalists and PIOs and being active on Twitter increases the likelihood of your research being cited. So basically, you know, being engaged in public engagement activities with information officers and so on, was actually linked to your academic success, if you wish. And that's like something that actually resonates. It's like, so you're not only serving the public or society or anything a little bit, if you wish, obscure, but you're actually serving yourself and your discipline as well. So that's one of the I would say, argument that actually pays off.
Ruth?
I mean, I think the thing that I always ask, particularly now working as a consultant, when people say to me, we want to improve our strategy for this, or we want to do better at that, my questions are always like, what is it you're trying to achieve? Who are you trying to reach, and how are you going to measure that? So I think if an academic is sort of asking you, why should they do outreach? Then you kind of have to get back to that point of what is it that they're trying to achieve? Do they want, in the example I gave in my earlier talk, do they want to reach international collaborators? Do they want to make their research more discoverable? If so, more discoverable to who? And that will help you determine the channels that they can use and the platforms that they can use to communicate, or that you can use to communicate with them. And then you have to really think, we have to be very professional about how do we measure that. And if we are measuring it and we're not achieving what we have set out to achieve, how do we adjust? How do we tweak? How do we reframe or reposition something in order to kind of reach the audiences that we want to reach? And if we're doing it well, then I think, that measurement also, the evaluation and the measurement also can provide you with the case studies to give to other academics. So you can say, well, I was working with this person and she wanted to communicate blah, blah, blah to these patient groups. And what we did was this, and we saw the tone change in the discussions there. And that will persuade this academic over here that they could maybe use similar tactics to reach other groups or other audiences that they want to. So I think, thinking about your objectives, thinking about how you're going to measure it, and then using those as case studies to persuade others.
I think you're saying that writing one press release and sending it on EurekAlert is not enough anymore.
No.
That you need to customize your service to the scientists in terms of their projects, what communities they want to reach, and then finding ways to work with them to reach those communities.
I think you can't forget the broad reach of mass media. And I think, 10 years ago, as we got these channels, we got excited about them, but actually you're never going to reach as many people on Twitter as you will by getting an article, like getting coverage in the New York Times. But you have to think about cross channels and how you can connect your communications across those different channels.
However, I would argue that it depends who you want to reach, because who reads the New York Times, and would go back to like our initial discussion about local media and local communities. It's not by being quoted in the New York Times that you're going to reach, potentially people in your local community. And let's not forget about local media as well.
Absolutely.
So one more online question,
Brian?
and then Rick.
Can I just add a comment to that?
Yes.
Sorry. So one thing with us is we're a Japanese university. We have both Japanese researchers and foreign researchers who primarily speak English as their first or their language of research. And one problem is that there's a barrier between these two. There's the language barrier between them. They don't necessarily always mix within the university. So we found in some cases that providing a Japanese researcher with an English language press release or an English language summary article about their research, they find that very useful for then explaining to foreign researchers what they do. So they find that valuable not just as a press release or not just as a marketing material, not marketing, public, that sort of material, but also for explaining to other people. And similarly, when we have a foreign researcher, we can do a Japanese summary of, say, an English press release or about their research. And they find that very useful within the university for communicating with their colleagues and explaining what it is they're doing. So obviously, we focus mainly on the people who we have enough researchers that we focus on the people who are interested in doing outreach, interested in promoting their research. But also, we have this added benefit. We can use something that is useful for them to kind of help engage them in promotion.
Jen?
Okay. This is from Sarah Hansen at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Regarding intrinsic trust in institutions, media outlets, and scientists, it seems today that trust is quickly eroding, and is there a role for PIOs to play in reversing that general trend? If so, what steps would you recommend PIOs take?
How can PIOs help reverse the trend of eroding trust in institutions?
So I would argue that actually the eroding trust in science is actually not a trend, and we'll have a paper coming out soon that actually look at trends. I mean, John Besley that works with the National Science Foundation, Science Engineering Indicator, just stepped out, but he could have argued with me on that. So as a matter of fact, trust in a lot of institutions is going down, but trust in university scientists, oh no, he's there. Is actually, staying at the top. So I think we should argue against that discourse that goes on saying, oh, trust in science going down the tube and really all doom. Actually, no, we are doing pretty well. Trust among some elements of society regarding the use of science in policy may not be as high as we would like, but that's very different from thinking about trust in science among the public. And consistently, trust in scientists at higher education institutions is really high, so it's really good for all of us. As a matter of fact, using scientists as sources and so on is something that actually can continue to help, having that positive trend that we see for trust in science.
Mm-hmm. I heard a presentation yesterday that said that when you're communicating science that is very far away from your daily life, people tend to trust you more. The more closer the topic becomes to your daily lives, like your health, then they become to trust you less. So maybe there is a difference in how you communicate astronomy versus vaccines. And I think that oftentimes we've kind of done the same thing for all studies and all disciplines. And perhaps the customization is something we need to look at. Rick.
Thanks. Rick Borchelt from the Department of Energy. This was a great segue from Dominique and from, I think, Sue, in terms of, as a PIO, where do I want to spend my time and energy and resources building trust? And I fully appreciate, Ruth, that, the reach of mass media is high. The trust is increasingly low.
Yeah.
So I have to make a decision. Do I follow my own ways of developing trust with my key stakeholders, or do I hand over my precious message to Nicholas for him to screw up in the New York Times? That's always a possibility. Every time we deal with mass media, you lose control of your message. When I can do that so much better by going directly to my key stakeholders and my audiences. And I think that's the issue many of us are facing in the PIO community. And one of the things that social media allows us to do is directly target the people who matter the most to us without praying that Nicholas gets it right and that they read that New York Times story and that they understand that New York Times story when they get to it.
So, I mean, it comes back again to who is it you're working for and what are you trying to achieve? And back when I worked in a medical research charity, we would put out information about cancer research that we wanted to reach the broadest possible audience. We were also a charity, so we wanted the broadest possible audience to read about what we were doing with the money that they donated and to think about giving money. So that was an objective. When I worked in the university sector, I was less worried about certain elements of the media and more worried about others, because you want students to trust you and you want parents or prospective students to trust you. So you're going to think about, I think what I was trying to say was, a decade ago we were all putting a lot of our resources into social media and podcasts and multimedia, and I think sometimes we talk about those channels and we forget about, but it's a mixture. I think there's a mixture of working with journalists and working closely and building trust with journalists to get the best possible results, and also working with communities and working with local communities, as Dominique said, but using social media to work directly with particular groups. But also you can listen much more closely with social media as well. You can listen to what people are saying and adjust based on their feedback.
Ginger?
I mean, my quick comment would be if I ever do screw up a story, you can email me and I will be sure correction is printed. You can look at my track record. There aren't many of those.
Yeah, it's not, that's a good point.
Interestingly enough, most headlines, as those of you who have worked in journalism, sometimes written by the editor, sometimes by the writer. In many cases, it's not the writer, but that depends on the publication. At the Times, it used to only be editors. Now it's a mix of the two. And Yeah, I agree. Headlines can totally be a journalist's own way of trying to make a story sexier. And yeah, that can lose trust in readers if it turns out the headline is overselling something. And that's something that we are very well aware of. And some people who take responsibility for it try their hardest to downplay headlines, even if they know their story won't get as great coverage, because, I mean, won't get read as widely. But yeah, that's definitely a publication by publication thing.
Ginger.
Ginger Penholster, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Well, I just wanted to say thank you, first of all, to the wonderful EurekAlert team and our distinguished speakers, because as you were speaking, I was thinking, man, I'm getting so much ammunition. So when I go back to my campus and somebody's pressuring me to write a news release that's not really news, or I'm getting heat from a researcher who's saying, that reporter didn't allow me to proofread the news article, I can say, well, at the EurekAlert seminar, this is what they were saying. They're professionals. So thank you for that. And I had just one quick tactical question. Nicholas mentioned experts databases. And women, 500 women in science was one you mentioned. For you or other journalists in the room, are there other mass sources like that that you find useful and credible, that you trust?
Yes, I mean, I have a colleague, a science journalist, who started one called Diverse Scholars that she's reached out to me about, and the idea there is similar to 500 Women. Women, obviously, as you know, people of color tend to be underrepresented in news stories. And if I could give a plug to a colleague of mine, fellow journalist, Ed Young, who wrote a beautiful story about diversifying his sources and how he's kept track of it and really kind of worked at that. And that was prompted by his colleague, Adrienne LaFrance, who was an editor of mine. Those exist, and the big three, I wouldn't say big three because they're both newish that are coming to mind, are Sciline, which I'm starting to learn more about, 500 scientists, women scientists, which after it was posted on Twitter and it's starting to gain some traction, and I've actually used that to find people about in paleoanthropology. And the one that a friend of mine has started, Diverse Scholars, all are very new. I would love to see if more of those resources grow, and if any more come to mind, I'll be sure to let you know. I would recommend, I guess, reaching out to the people who are in charge of those and saying, hey, these are scientists I have who would have a great place or a great fit on your websites. And I mean, for someone like me, it's useful as well, because when I am writing, sometimes my work, I'm writing about something that's a very small field where either everyone knows each other or, gosh, this person who I want to be as an outside source has co-authored so many papers with these people. I'll go to a source like that and I'll say, okay, here's a name. Let me look in their research history. Okay, they actually haven't collaborated on anything. This would be someone to reach out to. Yes.
My question is, how many of us in the room have done a stint as a journalist? So this speaks to the point of trusting PIOs. We've been in your chair, not at the New York Times probably, but we are vetting those researchers before we send you those news releases.
We have a question. Yeah, the gentleman.
Thank you. Hi, Tom Ulrich from the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. Shift of topic for a second. Cool the temperature down.
Thank you.
Just something that I've noticed just over the course of the last 3 or 4 days here in Austin, and Dominique, you in particular, I think you might have some thoughts on this. I've been sitting in on a lot of the public engagement with science talks over the last few days, and the one thing that's really struck me through all the seminars and all the speakers and whatnot is that there's a lot of encouragement and a lot of effort going into direct engagement between scientists and the public and various local communities and whatnot, But apart from one throwaway comment tucked away at the second to last minute of one of those sessions, I didn't hear science communications offices or PIOs mentioned once. And my fear is that there are complementary but slightly conflicting, contradictory tracks going on within the larger science communication field, where you've got these large efforts like, there was one that was here just, one of the ones I was speaking here today that's run by AAAS that's trying to get scientists to engage directly, which is awesome. The PIOs in here are also trying to engage with the public and get them interested in science as well. But those worlds aren't quite crossing over, it seems, as best they could, such that even our sort of capabilities as PIOs aren't being brought up to the scientists to say, hey, we can help you learn how to shape your messages, but that the scientists themselves don't even know that they're PIOs or that the communication office is there to help them. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how to bridge that gap so that we're all sort of helping each other get to that same point of getting the public to know more about the science that's going on in ways that are appropriate and within the context of different cultures and different communities.
I totally agree. I'm so glad you say that, because
come
I'm
on.
a proponent of actually making sure we don't oversimplify the world of science communication, and we credit all the actors that actually part of that, and that they all have a role to play. And to give you a practical example of how we think we can build that bridge, actually I have started an effort, my research group, with our PIOs in my college, a College of Agricultural Life Sciences at UW-Madison, to work exactly on that problem with the scientists in my college. But again, anecdotal evidence that actually depends on individuals, and we would like to have that actually gets much more institutionalized. But you have a really important point. And first of all, I go back to saying what I said at the beginning. We don't want every scientist to go there and do a job that maybe they don't know how to do. And John can comment about the job they did as far as looking at the training available. But we have people that are already trained to do that. So let's actually, use the capacity that we have and build on that capacity before reinventing the wheel. I don't have a straight answer in saying how to do it, but I hope that researchers such as us can actually work in that direction to emphasize how important it is to build those bridges.
Yeah, I can share a little bit of experience, my personal experience. I've always felt like PIOs are the wings beneath, the wind beneath the wings. We try to stay as unobtrusive as possible. We try to be supportive of scientists and journalists, but we oftentimes don't talk about what we do as much as we should. I used to work at the University of British Columbia, and we started out having a very difficult time getting newsworthy stories to publicize. And so we created a campaign, we call it the Don't Be Shy campaign. And we went out to department meetings and talk about what we do and the value that we bring to the university and the support we can give to scientists. And not just in media relations, but if you can tell a story well, you can give better presentations in classes to funders in community settings. And we try to make sure that our value isn't a news release writer. Our value is a communication facilitator and trainer. And so I think that as a community, we need to value ourselves better. We need to talk about our work in very explicit terms, and we need to feel empowered to stand up to situations where we might feel pressured by one side or another. I think that little kid needs to grow up a little and say, look, you guys need to stop bickering and do your jobs, and so that we can do ours. I really hope that you guys walk away with this with more empowerment of the value that you are bringing to this equation, and more so, but also the fact that I think we've heard that the diversity of voice is very important in reaching different communities. People trust people that they can connect to, and oftentimes it's people that look like them, the people who sound like them, perhaps somebody with an accent, and so in finding scientists as spokespeople, look for those diverse voices, but also remember that when you have diverse voices and diverse platforms, you're also giving up a lot of control. And that's challenging for both journalists and PIOs. But ultimately, it's our job to help the system work better, to help scientists become more confident in communicating directly to the public. So I'm going to close there on a high note. Thank you all for coming. We will make this recording available if you want to relive this experience. But please send us your feedback. We hope to do this more, and we hope to do this through online platforms that will be convenient to everyone. I want to echo thanks to the EurekAlert team for making this possible. The panelists were traveling here. And one last thing, EurekAlert serves both PIOs and reporters, and we feel that this mission is extremely vital to science communication. So we do sponsor conferences and workshops. We will be the lead sponsor to the UK Conference of Science Journalists in October. Oh, nice. We're also sponsoring the first Japan SciComm Forum in 2 months, and which is free for anyone to participate. So there are cards outside with more information. It will be in English and Japanese, but there will be a simultaneous communication. So please pick up a card on your way out. Have a great rest of the evening. We have our EurekAlert reception tomorrow at 3 to 5, where you can have a drink and continue to talk about this. Thank you for communicating science broadly.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
Sorry. That was great.
Hey, thank you.
A little bit like this. I was surprised to see that science journalists versus